Paris, still pulsating under the echoes of revolutions, the French capital was reborn in a whirlwind of contrasts. Imperial splendor on one side, working-class misery on the other. Between damp alleys and smoky cafes, a new type of character emerged, neither noble nor proletarian, but artist, visionary, dreamer, a voluntary exile from the bourgeois world. Thus was born Bohemia. This word, Bohemia, evoked, at first, a mixture of eccentricity and scandal. Borrowed from the gypsy people, the Bohemians were not nomads of the body, but of the soul. Artists who, like specters, slid between the cracks of society, rejecting conventions, fleeing from conformism, and seeking beauty where everyone only saw decadence. There was no glory for them in the palaces. His republic was made up of cheap wine, endless conversations, and incendiary loves. They lived in the Latin Quarter or on the slopes of Montmartre, sharing among themselves cold rooms, fiery words, and a fierce desire to change the world through art. Between the tables of the Café de la Nouvelle Athènes and the basements of Le Chat Noir, the flames of a new gospel were lit, that of aesthetic freedom. Painters such as Gustave Courbet painted poverty without filters. Poets such as Charles Baudelaire delved into the bowels of vice to extract poetry from it. Musicians, philosophers, playwrights, all threw themselves into a dangerous game between genius and self-destruction. But Bohemia was not born of abundance. She was the daughter of abandonment. Many died early, of typhus, of cold, of disgust. Still, as Henri Murger, the great chronicler of the first Bohemian generation, said, "Bohemia is a life and a religion." And for these believers, poverty was the cross, and art his resurrection. This book is a dive into that world, a world of golden shadows and flickering lights, of violent passions, heretical ideas, and eternal works. A world where art was more important than life, and often cost one's own life. Here, we will narrate the story of those who dared to live outside of time, who got drunk on absinthe to see the invisible, who kissed death on the corners of Boulevard du Clichy to touch eternity with ink-stained fingers. Welcome to French Bohemia.
Before Bohemia became a lifestyle, it was literature. And before it was literature, it was misery. And no one has united these two worlds as well as Henri Murger, the first chronicler of the damned of art, the poet of the ragged geniuses. It was the year 1830, The July monarchy had just replaced the revolution with promises of stability. But in the alleys of the Latin Quarter, the tumult continued. Only now, it wasn't political, it was aesthetic. Impoverished young people, armed with paper, coal, and disordered ideas, filled the cafes and basements of Paris in search of a revolution that was not fought with weapons, but with words, paints, and chords. They were painters who never sold paintings, poets who slept on park benches, musicians who played symphonies for cats and mice. Merger was among them, one of them, but also its herald. Born in 1822, Henri Merger was the son of a building doorman. From an early age, I knew the feeling of the cold without firewood, the stomach without bread, and the look without hope. But there was something that the bourgeois would never understand: the fire of art. It was with this fire that he began to frequent artist circles and write semi-autobiographical chronicles for cheap newspapers. From these chronicles, a book was born, and from this book, a myth was born. Scènes de la vie des Bohèmes, published in 1849, was not just a collection of stories, it was the construction of a universe. Merger depicted the life of a group of young artists in Paris, their tragic loves, their persistent hunger, and their unbreakable faith in art. Rodolphe, Marcel, Chaunard, and Colline, characters inspired by real people who slept and shared beds and discussed metaphysics between mouthfuls of watery soup, became archetypes of Bohemia. The strength of the book lay in its frankness. There was no glamour in disguise. The characters went hungry, died of cold, sold their coats to buy candles, and wrote poems that no one read. And even so, they insisted. Art for them was not a whim. It was the only salvation. The artist is a martyr who bleeds words instead of tears. Merger once wrote in a letter, that was his faith. The popularity of the scenes was instantaneous. The middle and upper classes were fascinated by the portrayal of Bohemian life. It was a Paris invisible to them, and at the same time, incredibly seductive. For the first time, the poor artist gained the status of a tragic hero. That changed everything. Before, the artist was a craftsman on the margins, a social failure. After Merger, he became a misunderstood romantic, a rebel with a cause, a tortured genius. Puccini's opera, La Bohème, directly inspired by the book, would help immortalize this ethos. But well before that, the impact was already being felt. Cafes began to be frequented by posers, young bourgeois people who dressed like ragged people to look authentic. Absinthe became fashionable. The contempt for conventions became a sign of intelligence. Bohemia, which was tragedy, began to transform into aesthetics. Merger, however, did not live long enough to see his legacy consolidated. He died in 1861, poor and sick, at the age of 39 years old, a true martyr of the art he portrayed. On his tomb stood a statue. He, on one side, embraced by a young woman, the muse of poetry, on the other, by a skull, a symbol of misery. The epigraph was clear: he lived and died in Bohemia. But what Merger started didn't end there. Quite the opposite. It was the fuse. His work worked as a call to arms for hundreds of young people who dreamed of freedom, authenticity, and greatness. It was possible, finally, to live outside the order and to be celebrated for it. In the following years, a new generation would emerge, more radical, more intense, damned poets, marginal painters, musicians drunk on ideas and wine. Bohemia was no longer just a narrative and became an embodied reality. The ground was prepared, the temple had been built, and the new prophets, Rimbaud, Verlaine, and Toulouse-Lautrec, were already marching to the altar. Bohemia was alive, and now immortal. If Murger and his generation shaped the myth of Bohemia, it was in Montmartre that he took meat. Not the flesh of literature or music, but the living, pulsating, exhausted, hallucinated flesh. Montmartre was not just a neighborhood. It was a state of mind, a battlefield between dream and vice, between genius and ruin. An unholy shrine where drunken gods sat next to prostitutes and painted, wrote, sang, and often died. There, among dusty alleys and forgotten mills, the new lineage of Bohemians was formed, the damned. Poets such as Charles Baudelaire, Paul Verlaine, and Arthur Rimbaud took poetry into darkness, mixing beauty and rottenness as never before. Painters such as Toulouse-Lautrec and Suzanne Valadon captured the deformed soul of cabarets and decrepit dancers. Montmartre became the inverted mirror of bourgeois Paris. Where there was luxury, they showed decadence. Where there was order, chaos. Where there was decency, desire. The heart of this artistic revolution beat in places like Le Chat Noir, a theatrical cabaret, concert hall, art gallery, pagan temple of the absurd. Founded in 1881 by Rodolphe Salas, the place brought together everything from students to anarchists, from hungry painters to women of dubious morals, all united by the same fever, to create. The sign with the black cat and golden eyes became an icon. There, scandalous jokes were mixed with dark poetry. It was the home of irony and tragedy. Nothing was sacred, and for that very reason, everything was art. It was there that Toulouse-Lautrec revealed itself, short, warped by the falls of childhood, but with a razor-sharp gaze. He painted the underworld with brutal tenderness. Dancers with empty eyes, drunk customers, women destroyed inside, all were portrayed with humanity and pain. Toulouse did not idealize, he understood, and that's why, perhaps, it was also lost. On a cold December night, Toulouse arrived at the Chat Noir carrying a new painting. It was a scene from the Moulin Rouge, the other temple of Bohemia, where the can-can was dance and provocation. Verlaine was sitting in the back, already stumbling with absinthe. Rimbaud disappeared, perhaps killed somewhere in Africa. Suzanne Valadon, Degas's former model, now painted with fury, breaking the boundaries of what was expected of a woman. They were the new avant-garde, an avant-garde that was wounded to create, who saw no distinction between art and suffering. Amid the smoke of cigarettes and the clinking of glasses, Verlaine stood up. Art, he said, is an open wound. Whoever closes it lies. Whoever exposes it bleeds. Toulouse smiled. He understood. Rimbaud, even absent, hovered like a ghost over everyone. The boy who, at 16, wrote verses that would make the academies tremble, and at 20 had already abandoned poetry, never to return. A comet, a scandal, an enigma. His poems spoke of enlightenment through chaos, of voluntary hallucinations, of the dissolution of morals. He was the absolute Bohemian, and also its biggest contradiction. But Montmartre was not made only of men. There were women, many women, and not just muses, artists, lovers, intellectuals, revolutionaries. Valadon, already mentioned, broke with the role of model to become a creator. In his works, female bodies were shown with strength and strangeness, without eroticism, male gaze, but with truth. She painted as if she were a challenger. This Bohemian generation was doomed from the start. It did not seek success, but for transcendence. It did not want comfort, but intensity. And this exacted a high price. Many died young. Verlaine, at 51, after a life of turbulent love affairs and imprisonment. Toulouse, at 36, of syphilis and alcohol. Rimbaud, at 37, in silence, far from France, denying everything he had written. And yet, they left a legacy that cannot be erased. They created an aesthetic. They founded an attitude. They challenged bourgeois morality with poetry and painting. They gave art an almost religious mission to reveal what the world wants to hide. In Montmartre, poverty was not just a condition, it was ideology. The refusal to succeed, the contempt for money, the surrender to madness, all were part of an implicit pact with artistic truth. Whoever sold himself was a traitor. Whoever kept himself pure, even if he died of hunger, was a martyr. But there was also beauty, a beauty that did not fit academic standards, a dirty, raw, imperfect beauty. The beauty of the posters pasted on the walls, the hoarse songs in the cabaret, the tragic love between two artists who knew they would not last, the beauty of the flame that consumes. Montmartre was at the same time the womb and the cemetery of Bohemia. There everything was born. There everything died. But while it lasted, it burned with an intensity that would never be equaled. and its light, however brief, illuminated the way for a whole generation of artists who would come later. In Paris, in New York, in Buenos Aires, in Berlin, they did not seek immortality, but paradoxically, they achieved it. The War of Bohemia was never won with swords, but with sharp words, dirty brushes, and laughter laden with poison. As the armies of Napoleon III and the Third Republic marched down the avenues reformed by Haussmann, another army, invisible, disorganized, but ferocious, spilled out across the dimly lit tables of the cafes of Paris. It was the trope of art. His generals did not wear uniforms, but colorful scarves, torn pants, and eyes burning with ideas. These spaces, the cafes, the cabarets, the corner salons, have become much more than meeting points. They were the battleground of a silent war for the soul of culture. The bourgeoisie wanted opera halls and official exhibitions. The Bohemians created the anti-stage, where art was not evaluated by curators or patrons, but by spontaneous laughter, relentless boos, and drunken applause. At the center of this strategy was Le Chat Noir, which had already become a symbol, but he was just the beginning. The Café de la Nouvelle Athènes, frequented by Manet and Degas, functioned as a laboratory of ideas. At the Moulin Rouge, the can-can was not just a dance, but an erotic provocation to Victorian morals. And at La Panegile, where Picasso would take his first steps, cheap wine watered discussions that ended in fights or immortal verses. These places didn't just welcome Bohemians, they shaped them. The physical space created the symbolic space. The graffiti walls, the crooked chairs, the fogged mirrors. Everything contributed to an aesthetic of imperfection. There, artists found not only company, but opposition. On every corner there was debate. In each verse, challenge. The Bohemia was not homogeneous. It was a creative turmoil. It is in this context that the so-called Bohemian culture wars arise. They didn't involve bullets, but manifestos. When the Impressionists were rejected by the official salon, they organized their own exhibition. When Baudelaire was tried for obscenity, he responded with even more lyrical venom. When critics ridiculed Lautrec for his obsession with prostitutes, he painted even more prostitutes. The answer was always the same: more art, more scandal, more intensity. These strategies were not improvised. They were conscious. There was a tactical intelligence behind the chaos. The Bohemians knew that in order to survive, they needed the public's attention, even if it was hostile attention. They became experts at hatching. They knew that the grotesque, the ugly, the scandalous could attract more than the conventional beautiful. And, above all, they knew how to use their own suffering as aesthetic raw material. One evening at La Panegile, two young men were arguing loudly. One was a poet, the other a painter. They disputed who was more needed by the world, the one who created images or the one who created words. My colors speak louder than your verses, and my verses last longer than their pigment. The discussion ended with a joint toast. The wine united what the ego almost separated. That was the spirit. Conflict and communion, vanity and sacrifice, all in the name of art. In addition to cafes, pamphlets and independent magazines have also become important weapons. The Gil Blas newspaper, for example, published some of the most daring short stories of the time. Anarchist serials, satirical chronicles, political caricatures, everything circulated on the tables of cafes, generating waves of indignation and admiration. Print was the machine gun of Bohemia, the feather its trigger. These publications also served to create a network of informal solidarity between artists. There, deaths, improvised exhibitions, calls for help were announced. The Bohemian had no union, but it had brotherhood. When one of them died of cold, everyone felt it. When one of them was arrested, everyone wrote in protest. When one of them was consecrated, as happened with Zola, for example, everyone vibrated, even with a certain envy camouflaged as sarcasm. But not everything was resistance. Gradually, the Bohemia began to be absorbed. The market insinuated itself. Critics looked to the new tragic genius to capitalize on. Booksellers published works that would have previously been censored, now as exotic merchandise. The figure of the marginal artist began to be romanticized. The real danger of dying of hunger was recycled into stories of overcoming for middle-class consumption. It was the beginning of a subtle domestication. Some resisted, others gave in. Toulouse-Lautrec, for example, agreed to paint advertising posters, but never stopped showing what no one wanted to see. Verlaine spent his last years between hospitals and salons, alternating prayers with blasphemies. Valadon found some stability, but she never reconciled herself with the world that had previously ignored her. Bohemia, like any radical movement, was continually swallowed up by what it fought, and even so, it continued to create fissures. In the midst of this battle, the figure of the accursed artist became a kind of profane priest. His habits, his vices, his suffering, everything was mythologized. It was not enough to paint well. It was necessary to suffer. It was not enough to write beautifully. It was necessary to have been rejected, humiliated, marginalized. Pain became a credential, poverty a virtue. The artist who did not go hungry was a suspect. And if there was a field where this battle was fought with more intensity, it was the night. Bohemia was nocturnal by definition. The day belonged to the bourgeoisie, to the conventions, to the responsibilities. The night was freedom. There, in the dim light of the cafes, in the red lights of the cabarets, in the shadows of the alleys, an art flourished that didn't fit the molds of the day. There, in every glass of absinthe, there was a toast to chaos. In each dissonant chord, a laugh against the order. In each crooked stroke, an affront to good taste. Bohemia, after all, was more than a way of life. It was a strategy of war against conformism. And the war, at that moment, was still far from over.
At first, they laughed at the Bohemians. Then
They began to fear them, in the end, began to imitate them. From the end of the 19th century, something strange happened in Paris. Those who were despised for their misery, mocked for their habits, and censured for their excesses began to become fashion. And with that, Bohemia crossed a critical frontier. It ceased to be just a symptom of artistic rebellion to become the living laboratory of the cultural avant-garde. The city was the heart of the world, and Montmartre its restless pulse. The Universal Exhibition of 1889, with its metallic and colossal Eiffel Tower, was a symbol of modernity, science, and progress. But in the basements below the tower, in the dark halls of the Chat Noir, and in the absinthe-impregnated corridors of the Moulin Rouge, another kind of revolution was brewing, a revolution of the form, the content, and the very function of art. It was in this atmosphere that the Bohemians stopped just provoking and started to influence. Symbolist poetry, born in the smoky taverns by Verlaine, Mallarmé, and Rimbaud, broke with narrative linearity and classical clarity. Fragmented verses, dreamlike images, intentional ambiguities emerged. The poem ceased to be a statement and became an atmosphere. Music accompanied this mutation. Debussy, in his first salons, composed liquid, ethereal, centerless sounds, lulling the salons with melancholy and mystery. It was the birth of what they would later call modernism, even if, for them, everything was just a sigh of the soul. Painting, then, suffered its great rupture. The traditional schools of fine arts reacted with indignation to what was beginning to emerge in the studios of the Bohemian neighborhood. Impressionism, already a thorn in the side of conservatives, had paved the way for a veritable explosion of styles. Paul Gauguin, fleeing Paris, painted Tahiti with colors never seen before. Van Gogh, though closer to Montmartre than they imagined, soiled the canvas with pain, passion, and light, and no one knew what to do with it. At Café Tambourine, Van Gogh exhibited his paintings and no one bought them. But the scandal was launched. The traditional form was dead, and the Bohemians danced over its grave. More than new styles, there was a new artistic posture. The artist as a visionary, as a martyr, as a herald of a future incomprehensible to the present. Art no longer explained the world, she recreated it, and this was terrifying for critics, for moralists, for politicians. The victory of the Bohemian was paradoxical. The more they were despised, the more they influenced. The more they were called sick, the more their delusions dictated fashion. Wealthy collectors, once scandalized, now bought paintings by Lautrec, words by Verlaine, sounds by Sadie. Bohemian art gained ground not because it had tamed itself, but because the world was beginning to deform around it. But with the achievement came the dilemma. After all, could Bohemia remain Bohemian after fame? Would art that is born of marginality survive recognition? Many artists have faced this contradiction with anguish. A brutal example was that of Paul Verlaine. When recognized as the Prince of Poets in the last years of his life, he found himself surrounded by young flatterers, bourgeois fascinated by his self-destruction. For them, Verlaine was a symbol. For Verlaine, it was a prison. He lived among hospitals and rented rooms, resentful, sick, and tired of his own myth. Another was Toulouse-Lautrec, already consecrated as the visual chronicler of Montmartre. When invited to exhibit in elegant salons, he responded with sarcasm and resentment. He said, "Paint your windows and leave me alone." His art did not fit in gilded frames. But among those who chose to embrace the transition, one name stood out: Pablo Picasso. A young Spaniard newly arrived in Paris at the beginning of the 20th century, Picasso plunged into Bohemia with fury. He lived with little, painted in a hurry, loved voraciously. He frequented Montmartre, absorbed every detail, every vice, every shadow. His blue phase was an ode to Bohemian melancholy. His pink phase, a tragic dance between clowns, circus performers, and loneliness. Picasso understood that Bohemia was the raw material, but not the end. It was he who would soon lead art to cubism, to abstraction, to total rupture. But that rise had deep roots in that dirty, fascinating world of late-night coffees, sick muses, shattered dreams. Bohemia had won, but like every victor, it began to face a new enemy: assimilation. The newspapers now praised those who had previously insulted. The galleries opened doors to rebellious children. The bourgeoisie, the same ones who had previously closed their windows to the sound of cabaret, now lined up to see exhibitions of Bohemian art. The victory brought a bitter taste, for the system that rejected them now incorporated them. Poverty became aesthetic, suffering, marketing, rebellion, product. Many resisted, some fled, others died. But the truth was undeniable. Bohemia was no longer underground. It was finally at the center stage. It was no longer just counterculture, it was culture. The war was not over, but now it was being fought in other camps. The world had changed, and much of it was due to them. Those who slept on torn mattresses, who wrote verses with trembling hands, who painted with blood and fever, had forever changed the history of art. And even if the world tried to domesticate them, Bohemia, in its wild essence, would continue to haunt the halls, to defy the museums, to whisper in the ears of those who still dare to create without permission. Paris dawned under a leaden sky, as if sensing the weight that day would carry. The Latin Quarter, normally alive with laughter, songs, and absinthe smoke, was silent. The taverns remained closed, the windows sealed. The city, an accomplice of what was being armed, held its breath. The Bohemianism, after all, had crossed an invisible line, and now the state, the church, and the bourgeoisie were ready to retaliate. For years, artists, poets, philosophers, and lovers of the night had built not only a lifestyle, but a refuge from the rigidity of a world ruled by dogmas and ciphers. Now this freedom threatened to become a political force, a dangerous ideology. The government saw in its meetings no longer mere hedonism, but a subversive organization. Conservative newspapers called the Bohemians the new arsonists of morals, and there was enough fire in their eyes to warrant fear. The night before,
a police raid surprised the Cabaret du Néant, where the most influential Bohemian spirits gathered in absent rituals and nihilistic declamations. Letters of denunciation had been sent to the Ministry of the Interior. Sacrileges, heresies, and sabotage plans were alleged. The painter Delaroque, the poet Marius Lénard, and the dancer and political agitator Violette, whose ritual dance show was described by the church as a demonic invocation, were taken into custody. On the same day, students and artists took to the streets in protest. The cry, "Liberté pour les fous sacrés," echoed through the sidewalks of Montmartre. Cafes have become centers of cultural resistance. In a hidden basement on the Rue des Martyrs, Anton Vallis, a journalist and informal leader of the political wing of the Bohemian, wrote an inflammatory manifesto denouncing the coordinated attack on the human imagination promoted by a state afraid of the dream. That night, the city became the scene of a battle without conventional weapons. Instead of gunpowder, poetry. Instead of swords, newspapers. Instead of grenades, pamphlets. But the confrontation was real, fierce, and painful. Repression didn't just come in uniforms. It came with censorship, arrests, smear campaigns, and the enforced silence of once free salons. The streets were divided. Traditional cafes refused to serve artistic types. Boarding house owners evicted tenants who wrote poetry. Government-aligned newspapers carried headlines such as, "Bohemia is a disease," and "Paris needs cleaning." Intellectuals aligned with the order tried to ridicule the Bohemians, calling them sentimental parasites, luxury vagabonds. But there was also unexpected resistance. In one of the most symbolic acts of the uprising, Émile Ferrand, a former bourgeois converted to the Bohemian circle, transformed his gallery into a temple of freedom. There she hung paintings of persecuted artists, recited censored poems, and exhibited love letters between women and men who lived outside of moral conventions. It was the counterattack of sensitivity. Meanwhile, the arrest of Delaroque, Marius, and Violette caused international unrest. Journalists from England and Germany denounced the abuses. Letters began to arrive at the French embassy. Bohemia, to the horror of conservatives, had become a symbol of global resistance. An erotic, tragic, and libertarian symbol, a fire with perfume. In the midst of it all, Violette, in a dark cell, wrote her masterpiece, "Roses Don't Grow in Cages," a small notebook of poems drenched in tears and anger, which would later be smuggled out of the prison by a guard touched by her verses. The book spread like gunpowder, multiplied clandestinely in the city's printing presses, read in alleys, staged on improvised stages. It was this little book that changed everything. At the height of tension, hundreds of students marched towards the Palace of Justice with excerpts from the poem painted on banners. The authorities were forced to give in. They released the prisoners, even though they were under surveillance. But it was too late. The state had lost something it didn't know could be taken: control over the narrative. The battle, therefore, had no clear winner, but it had consequences. Bohemia is no longer marginal. It became a movement. It became an idea. It became a myth. Those who returned to the streets were no longer just painters or nocturnal drunkards. They were heralds of a sensible new order. But not everyone came out unscathed. Delaroque never painted with the same fury again. Marius, aged in spirit, plunged into silence, and Violet, though transformed into a revolutionary muse, never danced in public again. Each of them carried a scar within them, the mark of having been too free in too little time. Still, on the graffitied walls of Montmartre, a phrase began to multiply in red paint. Art won, even if wounded. And Paris, even under the fog of repression, never slept the same way again.
Paris was different. It was still buzzing in its cafes, its alleys, and its smoky halls. But there was a new silence hanging over Montmartre, as if the walls of stucco and stone had heard too much. Bohemia, which for decades had been just a whisper of revolt and cheap wine, now had a body, a form, and a name. And this form, like everything that reaches its apex, carried with it the weight of an empire in gestation, not yet political, but artistic, cultural, perhaps even spiritual. The unification of Bohemia did not happen with marches or flags. It happened between brushstrokes and sketches, between glasses of absinthe and rehearsals of theatrical plays. It was as if all the bastard children of modernity had finally found a common home, an empire without borders, but with its generals. Rimbaud, with his incendiary poetry, Toulouse-Lautrec and his women in ink and pain, Sarah Bernhardt dominating stages as if they were thrones. Each one, in their own way, carried the crown of a new time. The proclamation of the empire, however, was not made in newspapers or in the tribunes. It took place at the Universal Exhibition of 1889, the same year that the Eiffel Tower rose like an iron spear in the heart of Paris. That monstrous structure, detested by many, worshipped by few, had become an inescapable symbol of the new age. The Bohemians saw in it the sign that the old world no longer dictated the rules. The tower, as they said, was ugly as progress, devoid of the old grace, but charged with the potency of the future. On opening night, as fireworks lit up the sky, a select group of artists, writers, and thinkers gathered in the halls of the newly opened Moulin Rouge to celebrate the silent victory of their marginal tribe. They were not in the official tribunes, but amidst feathers, smoke, and the sounds of can-can, they proclaimed that the empire of the free spirit was established, that art would no longer ask permission, that desire, scandal, and contradiction had overcome conformism. Zéphirine Moreau, now with gray hair and a tired look, watched everything with a mixture of pride and regret. The young man who had once dreamed of painting invisible Paris now saw his youth crystallized in monuments and movements. In his diary, the same one he had kept since the days of the Commune, he wrote, "We have unified the fragments, but there is a price in the crystallization of what was chaos. When art ascends the throne, it also assumes the bonds of the nobility." He knew that unification brought dangers, that the institutionalization of Bohemia made it, paradoxically, less savage, and that, little by little, the cafes where poetic revolutions were once plotted were becoming tourist attractions. The Bohemian Empire, now recognized, began to be consumed. Sarah Bernhardt, in the midst of a new premiere, uttered a phrase that spread through the pages of the newspapers. What was a curse has become fashionable, and may God forgive us for that. Academic salons, which had once mocked the Impressionists and Symbolists, now celebrated them. Museums acquired works that had been despised decades earlier. The critics surrendered. The bourgeoisie bought paintings that itself had condemned. It was as if the fire had been tamed to warm the palaces. The Bohemian Empire became respectable, and this respectability was, for many, a kind of betrayal. However, amidst the discontent of some veterans, a new generation emerged, legitimate and bastard children of the institutionalized Bohemia. They were the decadents, denialists, the avant-garde, men and women who looked at the newly proclaimed empire and asked, "And then what? Where do we go when transgression becomes tradition?" The unification was a culmination, but also a turning point. The cultural empire was established. The world knew who the Bohemians were, and Paris itself, already shaped by this spirit, celebrated and swallowed them. But on the margins of this new throne, the ghosts of what was to come were already forming. The emptying, the trivialization, and the inevitable collapse of everything that dared to be eternal. The empire had been proclaimed, but its throne was of smoke and iron. As Bohemia left the alleys and basements to occupy the halls of high culture, something essential was lost in the process, something that could not be measured in positive reviews or tickets sold. The centralization of art, thought, and aesthetics in a single pole, Paris, the city of light, was beginning to show its bones. The same artists who had helped build the new cultural temple now looked at it with unease. Zéphirin Moreau wrote less and drank more. His last works were dense, opaque, almost gloomy. The once nimble stroke was now thick and slow, as if each brushstroke was an effort against time. His eyes, once filled with idealistic fury, now carried the fog of doubt. He realized that by uniting the talents of Bohemia under a single banner, they had sacrificed vital chaos, the anarchic element that made every artistic gesture an act of rebellion. The Paris that had flourished as the capital of the imagination was now suffocating by its own success. Young artists from the interior of France, Italy, Russia came on pilgrimage to the city, hoping to touch glory with their hands. But they found invisible walls, closed circles, inaccessible studios. Centralization had transformed Paris into a fortress of prestige, where recognition was granted by a handful of critics and patrons, and no longer by the breath of chance or scandal. There was also the physical cost. Absinthe, which was once the fuel of poets, was now the poison of the forgotten. Lautrec, already broken by syphilis and alcohol, could barely get out of bed. He died at the age of 36 in a clinic with a bottle of brandy next to his bed and a pad of unfinished sketches on his lap. Her mother cried silently. The city did not. For Paris, he was already an icon, and icons don't die, are appropriate. Cafes that once hosted incendiary discussions now served tourists. Chat Noir sold souvenirs. The cabaret's murals had been retouched with new paint, removing the imperfections, and with them, the soul of the place. Everything seemed too clean, too safe. Rebellion had been tamed, packaged, sold as French charm. Sarah Bernhardt, although still on stage, felt the weight of time. An infection had taken part of his leg, but not his vanity. He continued to perform with a prosthesis, challenging the baddie as he had defied convention. But even she knew. Her image was already being carved into statues. The world already saw her as a legend, and legends are rarely allowed to live simply. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Paris and in the forgotten provinces, young artists with no connections languished. Their names did not appear in art magazines. His works were ignored. Many sank into misery, others into despair. The unification, by concentrating the brightness in a single lighthouse, had left many candles extinguished. Centralization generated hierarchies, filters, exclusions. Those outside the magic circle of the Bohemian metropolis simply disappeared. Some tried to resist. Anarchist collectives emerged trying to revive the decentralized spirit of the early vanguards. They tried to spread art in the streets, to give poetry back its place on dirty walls and train tickets. But the city was stronger now. Its gears were oiled. Galleries, gyms, competitions, everything worked like a machine for grinding novelty and spitting fashion. There was a price in becoming a world reference, and that price was the fragmented soul of dozens of artists who would never be heard. The Bohemian system, now institutionalized, no longer tolerated true failure, only performative failure, the one that becomes a myth and a memoir. Real misery, naked oblivion, had become invisible. Zephyrin, in one of his last diary entries, wrote, "We have created a temple, but we have forgotten the lesser altars. The empire that we dreamed free now requires a passport, and some of us never learned to ask permission." Funerals became frequent. Names that in other times would cause an uproar were now just footnotes in newspapers, and the young people who came with their pockets full of dreams and sketches often ended up leaving with empty eyes or not leaving at all. They became shadows. Centralization brought order, visibility, recognition, but it also created filters, protocols, vanities. The creative chaos of the beginning had given way to the bureaucracy of glory. Bohemia had become an institution, and like any institution, it started to generate its excluded. The price of the light was the shadow, and Paris, which had once welcomed all wanderers, now selected the faces that could shine under its reflectors. The rest was lost on the margins. France's cultural empire, now consolidated under the gilded halls of the Belle Époque, shone like an orderly constellation. But between the forgotten alleys of Montmartre and the smoky alleys of the Latin Quarter, hearts that refused surrender still throbbed. They were the last Bohemians, no longer a vibrant crowd, but specters of an era that refused to die. They called each other the Dark Ones, the Real Ones, or just artists. While Paris erected monuments to the official taste, they dug symbolic catacombs. The clandestine galleries multiplied. The poems were read in whispers, away from the ears of the Academy. The songs played by dirty hands on worn instruments still made the fury of freedom vibrate. Among them, one name still resonated with reverence: Émile Garneau, the last incendiary poet. With his eyes marked by absinthe and his calloused hands of the night typography, Émile kept alive an illegal publishing house, Les Fils Noirs. His pamphlets denounced the domestication of art, the repression of bodies, and the forgetting of the dead. He published forbidden names. He re-edited the verses of Louise Renard, who disappeared in 1887 after a speech against the Ministry of Culture. Some said she lived in voluntary exile in the mountains of Corsica, others that it had been silenced. The persecutions became more sophisticated. There were no more arrests in the public square. Now the rebels were silenced with defamation lawsuits, sponsorship cuts, economic blackmail. Bohemia, reduced to lightning, was classified as aesthetic subversion. In art schools, the curricula were sanitized. Abstract painting was ridiculed. The expressionist nude censored. The academies laughed at everything that did not obey the rules of the grand goût français. It was then that a last collective act of resistance emerged, the Night of the Burning Hearts. In 1903, 50 artists, writers, musicians, and anarchists met secretly in an abandoned former textile factory in Belleville. That night, they held a last forbidden exhibition. Distorted sculptures, blood paintings, poems written directly on the walls with charcoal. An orchestra played atonal pieces under candlelight. It was ugly, intense, free. Among the present were Clarin Dubois, an expressionist painter arrested in 1901 for obscenity, Elaine Darcy, a ballerina expelled from the opera for protest choreographies, Gustave Leroux, a deaf musician who composed symphonies with underground beats, and Theo, the youngest, only 19 years old, who believed that art could still set the world on fire. The next morning, the police raided the shed. Nothing remained, neither pictures, nor bodies, nor words. Some say they escaped, others that disappeared like smoke. Only an anonymous letter was found on the wall. Art only lives where there are no cages. Where it is domesticated, it dies. The final crackdown sealed the silence, but like every seed that rots in the ground, something has begun to germinate under the Parisian sidewalks. The graffiti is back. Anarchist songs resurfaced in alleys. A small newspaper called La Clotte, created by former apprentices of Émile Garneau, began circulating on handmade mimeographs. The spirit of Bohemia was not dead. It was hidden. Thus, the flame of the last rebels did not go out. It transformed, in memory, in legend, underground. Paris was following its imperial course, but under its feet, in the cracks of its pride, grew the roots of what would become decades later the explosion of the 20th century avant-garde. The last rebels did not lose. They planted. They disappeared in time to resurface at the right time. And so the Bohemian, wounded, silenced, clandestine, it remained eternal.
When the lights of the Belle Epoque finally went out under the din of the trenches of World War I, many believed that Bohemia had died out along with the Romantic centuries. But they were wrong. The Bohemian had not died, it had become a seed. Buried under the ashes of war, it germinated quietly on the margins of the system, preparing to blossom with new fury in the decades to come. The cafes of Montmartre, now emptied, held the echo of the incendiary discussions that shaped the modern spirit. The words of Verlaine and Rimbaud had not been lost. They had been devoured by young people who, in the face of the industrial horror of war, sought meaning in everything that reason could not reach. The 20th century was born with rupture fever, and the ghosts of Bohemia were lurking. In Berlin, New York, Buenos Aires, cities taken by uncertainties and dreams of reconstruction, artists resumed the impulse that French Bohemia had ignited. Dadaism, Expressionism, jazz, the Beat Generation. They all carried something of that indomitable spirit that had been incubated in the Parisian basements. But there was a crucial difference. If the French Bohemia of the 19th century was nourished by a tragic romanticism and a boiling Paris, The new forms of Bohemia were born under a fragmented and post-traumatic world. They were less hopeful, but infinitely more radical. It was in the United States that one of the greatest transfigurations was consolidated. The beatniks of the 1950s, direct heirs of the cursed poets, refused the logic of consumption and morality. They wandered the roads, wrote in fury, challenged governments and structures. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs were each in their own way bastard children of Baudelaire's Paris, but they now spoke to the sound of bebop and against the backdrop of the Cold War. In France, however, the return of the Bohemian spirit would not be long in coming. The 1960s exploded in May '68, and the students, the artists, the intellectuals all invoked the radical freedom that had once lit up the nights of the left country. Sartre walked between barricades. Simone de Beauvoir spoke to crowds. The ideas of freedom, marginality, and insubmission came back with force. What was once a nightly whisper in cafes has become a cry in the streets. But unlike the 19th century, now the system responded more skillfully. He incorporated, digested, and sold rebellion in the form of a product. The big publishers turned dissidents into bestsellers. Cinema turned bohemians into style icons. The market was beginning to shape the spirit that had once been anti-system. Still, in the underground of the metropolises, small circles resisted. Theater groups, literary cooperatives, street artists, all trying to keep the fuse that had illuminated the steps of Toulouse-Lautrec or Modigliani lit. They knew Bohemia could never be mainstream. Whenever it became too visible, it died and was reborn in another corner. As the 21st century progressed, the question remained: was there room for Bohemia in a digitized, fast-paced, algorithmic world? Many said no, that Bohemia depended on physical encounters, human warmth, shared nights. But others saw the new Montmartre on the internet, chaotic, dirty, without rules, full of dissenting voices. Marginalized influencers, Instagram poets, activist hackers, independent musicians, all could be, in some way, imperfect reincarnations of the original Bohemia. It wasn't the same, of course, but the impulse was the same: to live on the margins, to challenge the norm, to embrace excess, to seek beauty in the midst of chaos. In the end, what French Bohemia bequeathed was not an aesthetic, but a posture towards the world, a way of living that despises conventions, that prefers grandiose failure to secure mediocrity, that throws itself headlong into love, art, and perdition. It taught that living can also be an act of creation. And even if the streets of Paris no longer resonate with Baudelaire's drunken footsteps, and the cafes are filled with tourists and laptops, the Bohemian spirit, that one, survives. In every young person who refuses the path traced,
in every voice that sings outside the core, in each artist who chooses to lose everything to gain himself. The empire has passed, the dynasty ended, but the seed is still alive, growing up in silence, waiting for the next night, waiting for the next wine, waiting for the next scream.
They tried to bury her. They called it decadent, unproductive, irresponsible. They said that there was no more room for their delusions in a practical, efficient digital world. That the days of smoky coffees, of eternal conversations under midnight were gone. But they forgot something fundamental. The Bohemian never asked permission to exist. It does not live in laws, nor does it survive in history books. It lives in moments, in a burning look at the empty audience, in a poem written on a napkin, in a song recorded on her cell phone at 3 a.m, drunk with raw emotion. Bohemia doesn't need Paris, nor of golden centuries. She just needs someone willing to lose everything except the intensity. It's not about the perfect art. It's about the mistake, the risk, laughter in despair, the dance under the collapse. Bohemia flourishes where the world falls apart. It finds meaning precisely in what the system discards: the improbable, the pathetic, the exaggerated, the sublime. And that's why she survives. Because as long as there is a human being who refuses to be a cog, who chooses delirium to obedience, dreams to security, love to calculation, Bohemia will still breathe. Maybe not as a movement, but like a sacred virus, an ancient whisper in the ear of those who do not accept to live in silence. It is there, between the gaps, in a neon-lit alley where a girl paints stars on the ground with wet chalk, in a forgotten bar where a drunken old man recites Shakespeare to no one, in a digital underworld where an anonymous avatar writes verses that no one reads, and yet they change everything. Bohemia doesn't have to win. It just needs to keep going. Because as long as there is chaos, there will be beauty. As long as there is night, there will be wine. And as long as there is a wandering soul willing to cry out against the world, the Bohemian, that impossible lover, will live.